You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Ataman Özyıldırım, Global Research Chair at the Conference Board, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of the Indications podcast, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I will be sitting down with my colleagues, Dana Peterson, who is Executive Vice President and Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and Ilaria Maselli, who is the Senior Economist for Europe in Brussels, the Conference Board as well. We will be discussing the latest results from the C-Suite Challenge survey, leading through the COVID-19 recovery. Today, we focus on the implications for economies and businesses from a global perspective. This annual survey gauged the latest thinking of CEOs and C-suite executives from around the world about their biggest business challenges in 2021. Among the top stressors worldwide, respondents primarily cited COVID-19, recruiting and retaining top talent, recession risk, vaccine availability, and accelerating digital transformation. The survey, C-Suite Challenge 2021, was conducted between November 7th and December 10th, right after the US elections. More than 900 CEOs and more than 600 C-suite executives weighed in from primarily three regions: Europe, Asia, and North America. Without further ado, let's start with the external challenges that are top of mind for these executives. For about a year now, we've been living with a global pandemic, and while there's good news about newly developed vaccines being delivered every day, there's no sign that COVID-19 is going to go away soon. We want to know what's top of mind for business leaders in this environment. My first question is to Dana. Dana, what are the top external challenges these executives are responding about? Those are the things that are outside the direct control of business leaders.
Sure, Ataman. Globally, COVID-19 and recession risks, as you said, ranked among the top external concerns among C-suite executives. A close third was vaccine distribution, but also important were changing consumer buying habits, geopolitics, regulation, and global trade disruptions. Most of these concerns are interlinked in our view. Indeed, the pandemic induced a major downturn in global economic activity last year. The evolution of the virus weighs heavily on when businesses can reopen, workers can return to work, and households can return to normal activity. Still, the pace of recovery has been slow for many economies and industries, and economies that do not specialize in exports and industries that have extreme exposure to in-person services are faring worse. Also, many households have suffered considerable losses in income and experienced unemployment. The pandemic has also affected global supply chains, causing firms to consider reshoring and nearshoring. Plus, mobility restrictions have completely shifted how consumers spend dollars and time. Political stability has been challenged by the virus with mixed success. Notably in the U.S. and Gulf states, politics are highly tied to regulation, which can certainly affect business operations.
Thank you, Dana. So clearly, major disruption shared by all of us globally. Turning to Ilaria in Europe, what's your take on what we're hearing from these CEOs and C-suite executives? Do the Europeans differ when it comes to their top external challenges?
Well, Ataman, I would say no, in the sense that a multinational is a multinational, no matter where the headquarters is located. So, if you look at the very top of the list of concerns, these are pretty much the same for European CEOs. So, of course, the pandemic is number one. Of course, the availability of vaccine is there also in the top three, and the fear of a downturn is also very much felt on this side of the world. I think in order to get to the different priorities, we have to go further down the list. And if I look, for example, at the ranking of CEOs in Germany, there is a couple of things that stand out that rank higher in Germany than elsewhere. And I'm talking about the compression of margins due to the recession and the lack of infrastructure investment. And I think that's interesting as a different point of view.
Thank you, Ilaria. So clearly a shared global experience, but there are concerns that could be varying depending on where you are. We see that respondents are less concerned this time around about global trade disruptions and global geopolitical risk, which used to rank higher, but they've come down in their ranking. But beyond those concerns, what emerges as a significant source of risk or disruptions for businesses in these CEOs' minds in the coming year? So I'll ask first Dana, and then we'll go to Ilaria. What is the economist's perspective about these risks and disruptions?
Sure. I think a lot of our perspectives are pretty similar to what CEOs are thinking. And I just want to make a comment about the fact that businesses are not as concerned about geopolitics. And I think a lot of it had to do with the changing in administrations in the US, where there's kind of this general belief that there's going to be more internationalism and multilateralism, making up with allies between the US and a number of economies, and that potentially there might be a softer tack towards China. So I think that whole changeover in the U.S. had some implications. But in terms of what economists are thinking, there's certainly upside risks as well as downside risks. Starting with the downside, a lot of it does indeed relate to the evolution of the pandemic and certain areas of geopolitics and inhibitors to global trade certainly are key downside risks. But I mean, there are upside risks also, and certainly, the pace of the vaccine rollout. We're seeing some countries are doing very well. For example, Israel, China are doing very, very well in terms of rolling out the vaccine. And there's also a lot of positives in terms of investment in digital transformation that we think are going to be very positive, not only in the short run, but also for the longer run outlook for the global economy.
Thank you, Dana. And Ilaria, what is the European economist's perspective?
On the risks for this year, I would say number one, the vaccine rollout, number two, the vaccine rollout, and number three, the vaccine rollout. And I think really CEOs got it right there, because we circulated the survey just after the US election, so 7th of November, for a month there. And if you remember, at that moment, there was a lot of enthusiasm, because it was the moment where the vaccines were starting to get the approvals from medicine agencies. And so there was a lot of enthusiasm there. And yet they put the availability of vaccine as the number three concern globally. And I agree with that, because the way the campaigns go really will decide when the real economic recovery will start. And it looks like it's going to be sooner in some countries like Israel. UK is also doing well if we look at European countries, but it will be later in other countries. And so, this will make a difference for Q2 or Q3 and for the overall economic performance for this year.
So it seems like 2021 will be all about vaccine, vaccine, vaccine. In our next segment, we'll talk about internal challenges. And let's turn to those things that business leaders can directly manage or change within their organizations by pulling various levers inside their organization. Dana, so what do they think about their internal challenges? For example, what do they think about how and where work is going to be conducted within their company?
Absolutely. Well, regionally, accelerating digital transformation ranked, if not number one, then in the top 5 items firms are focused upon from the survey. This is unsurprising in our view, given the acceleration of digital activity trends, including remote work, e-commerce, telehealth, streaming, online education, and virtual experiences. Firms have had to suddenly invest in technology to meet these new demands. And closely related is improving innovation. Firms are learning that digital transformation can be accomplished in months, not years. Hence, creating a culture of innovation, which are also things that rank very highly on the list, to succeed in the digital transformation era is paramount. Also, lowering costs and streamlining processes also ranked very high on the list of internal concerns. Potentially, the sudden shift to remote work plays a role in the frequency of this response. Remote work may allow firms to hire labor in less expensive cities or even countries, and some firms are contemplating changing wage structures to accommodate remote work, which, from an economist's point of view, might raise some concerns about wage compression. Also, firms may be considering how to use technology and automation to better deliver services. Indeed, all these changes may require material modifications to business models, which is also a top concern.
Thanks, Dana. You touched on this a little bit, but staying with internal challenges, what do you think are the implications, short-term implications for markets and the business environment? So, for example, the impact on employment, the workforce, and investment.
Sure. I think the implications for labor markets are manifold. Remote work means the geographic democratization of labor, which benefits both employers and workers. So employers are no longer limited to hiring labor in close proximity to the office, and workers can move to lower cost regions. The rise in technologically related activities will, however, create deeper fissures between workers who are highly skilled versus not skilled, STEM versus non-STEM, and also between jobs that are automatable versus non-automatable, right? So workers and employers will have to consider each of these factors with regards to how workers obtain education, train themselves, also how businesses focus on training and hiring and retention.
Thanks, Dana. Ilaria, do you have any reactions to what you heard from Dana just now? But also, are European businesses as concerned about digital transformation and innovation as their US counterparts?
I would say yes, definitely, Ataman. And we have seen that in all surveys. No matter what question you ask, number one response is always the digital transformation ever since the pandemic started. Now, what it means in practice, I guess, depends. It depends on where you're sitting, depends by the company, by the type of business. But if I look at the survey results of this year, I would say that there is a couple of things that stand out in the European responses. Probably the main one is the fact that European CEOs don't think that they need to change the business model of their companies. I find this particularly interesting because we know, how disruptive the digital transformation can be. And so what they associate that with is more, of course, with data analytics, but also with streamlining processes, for example, or with M&A or partnerships. This is actually an interesting part because we argued in the C-suite challenge of last year that the key to success in the future would be really, the ability to create new partnerships. And in a way, we were right because we see this ranking much higher this year, and in a way, probably COVID it's accelerating also this approach.
Thank you, Ilaria. I think this is a good time for us to take a short break. We'll be right back after the announcement to continue our conversation with my colleagues Dana Peterson and Ilaria Maseli on the C-Suite Challenge 2021 survey findings.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Welcome back to the second part of our conversation on the Indications podcast. I'm speaking to my colleagues Dana Peterson and Ilaria Maseli at the Conference Board. We're discussing the C-Suite Challenge 2021 survey findings. Now we'll turn to the long-term legacies of the global pandemic. Many observers are thinking that after the pandemic, we're going to be faced with a new normal. How the world will be different after the pandemic recedes in the rearview mirror. Hopefully, that will be sooner rather than later. But some of the contours of what that new normal is beginning to emerge as in the responses of what we were hearing from the business leaders who took our survey. Dana first, and then Ilaria. What are the long-term legacies from the global pandemic? What do you see in the survey?
Among CEOs and also CHROs, reduced business travel ranked as the top long-term legacy from COVID-19. This was followed by reduced office space, more resilient supply chains, greater automation, large firms having better access to capital markets relative to smaller firms, and also a greater focus on social and climate change issues. We're not at all surprised by the top ranked item. Indeed, travel and tourism was among the most negatively impacted industry amid the pandemic. And it's probably going to continue to see major changes and a very lengthy recovery, even once vaccines get into the arms of most of the people in the world. Moreover, the rise in telework and the comfort that clients have with telecommunications, video, chatting, Zoom, Teams, suggests that business travel may be changed forever. Businesses have seen tremendous reductions in costs for travel, as many of us are working from home, and may wish to retain those savings. Similarly, remote work is reducing the need for office space, especially in large city centers. And that's going to have implications for commercial real estate as well as for all the retail that is surrounding that whole culture that we had around going to the office. And certainly that's also going to have implications for transportation within these large city centers that have a lot of office space. But potentially you could see some office space move to suburbs and rural areas. We've already discussed how automation is a big theme that will continue to gain traction with firms. But thinking about these other things in terms of global supply chains, disruptions of the U.S.-China trade war during 2018 and 2019, plus the pandemic-related shortages of many principal goods like food and PPE last year and even extending into this year, really alerted many firms to the risks of having geographically dispersed supply chains. Indeed, we expect more onshoring/reshoring and also diversification of supply chains going forward. So, for example, if most of your supply chains were in China, maybe you might think about extending them to some of the ASEAN nations. So, and with all of this, the shifting around of these global supply chains, either bringing them home or building them out in a region or even diversifying to other countries, it's going to produce winners and losers among economies, among industries, and among households.
Thank you, Dana. And Ilaria, what's your take on the long-term legacies from the global pandemic?
Well, there are a few interesting things. I know we will talk about trade next, so I will leave that aside for a moment. On business travel, I think the view is quite unanimous, right? I think none of us expects to spend as much time in airplanes and airports, even after the pandemic, as much as we spent, for example, in 2019. I think that view is really shared everywhere. On the future of work, there is some interesting results that stand out in the survey. One thing is some sort of candid admission that some companies in Europe need to upgrade their virtual work capability. A lot of companies were caught unprepared when the pandemic started in that sense, because there was less openness to telework in some European countries than in the US, for example. Then there is another issue that is interesting, and that's a sort of new interest in a new openness towards the idea of splitting work from location. It's something that also Dana mentioned, this idea of hiring people in a different geography. Again, something that was not very common before. I know there was a trend, an increasing trend already before the pandemic between US states to hire across different US states, but that is very rare here. And now there is some sort of openness in that direction. And then the other issue, which is very different compared to the US, is also this idea that compensation and benefits need to adapt to the fact that we work in a different way. I see a lot of colleagues, a lot of members that talk about this in the US, and I think this is less of a topic here. I don't know if it is a matter of yet, if it will become in the future, or will continue to not being an important topic.
Very interesting. Thanks, Ilaria, for those observations. I think it's clear that we're not going to go back to the way things were, and we'll end up in some sort of a hybrid business environment after the dust settles. But we're not quite sure where we're going yet, although there's clearly a different path ahead of us.
There is actually one thing that I think will go back to where it was, and that's the increasing attention towards climate change and the impact of climate change on the way we do business and we consume. I think it was put a little bit aside, in the first months after the pandemic, and I see that coming back, at least in Europe, both in the list of priorities for CEOs, but also if I look at our consumer confidence, global consumer confidence index, it started to be mentioned as an important factor again.
Interesting. That's a good point to keep an eye on. Both Dana and Ilaria mentioned globalization and the future of global trade. That's the topic we'll turn to in our last segment. Another trend that was undergoing some major shifts even before the global pandemic was the rethinking that was going on about the future of globalization, and specifically around global value chain, where things are produced, where things are shipped between economies. So we probed a little bit in this survey about what CEOs and C-suite executives think about these globalization issues. Ilaria, you also spent some time with the conference board team writing about global trade and global value chains. Is there anything in the survey findings that surprised you?
Well, there is a lot of things, and at some point you're going to have to stop me because I can talk about this forever. But I'll try to summarize a couple of points. The first thing that is extremely interesting, and then I referred to that at the beginning of the podcast, is the fact that the concern about trade disruptions is no longer a top concern in Europe. It is very high in China, but in Europe it came down compared to the last years. And I think there is a clear interpretation there, in the sense that European CEOs associate the change in administration in the US with a possible return of multilateralism, and also with the fact that there will be fewer surprises, less unpredictability, on things like tariffs being applied all of a sudden to certain businesses. So I think the message is quite clear that European CEOs are a little bit more relaxed about this. Not the same can be said about Chinese CEOs, which probably think that there's going to be a change in tone in the conversation with the U.S. peers, but not a major change in the substance of the tensions. The other thing that is interesting is the fact that European CEOs as well put quite high the need to the expectations that some supply chains will be localized. And this has been a big topic here as well, of course, especially if you think about some key supply chains in the medical sector, for example. That was a big source of disputes even between European countries, not only between European countries and other geographies, but really even within Europe. It was a big problem at the beginning of the pandemic. However, I would say, and I'm interested in hearing a different point of view on that, but I would say that all in all, globalization is doing much better now than in March or April. I think we all expected at some point, we were all afraid that the production networks would collapse. And at the end of the day, if you exclude some very specific pharma-related supply chains, at the end, everything was restored actually quite fast, and trade in fact rebounded within 6 months. And this was very different compared to 2009, when it took many quarters before trade came back to the pre-crisis level, and now we saw trade rebounding really fast. So yeah, I would say that the globalization system passed the big test of the COVID shock after 9 months.
Well, it's great that you love to talk about this topic, and maybe that's going to be the subject of another podcast. But these are interesting sort of long-term questions as well, and it is good to see that some of those global relationships and supply chains were actually beneficial to get the vaccines developed and moved around, and were helpful in the end. So we're coming to the end of our podcast. Last question is going to be for Dana. Inevitably, the conversation comes back to COVID-19 and vaccines and medical care. I think we saw that happening just now as well. The state of globalization could have implications on the availability of vaccines worldwide in the near term, but also in the long term. As we've been hearing recently, no one is safe until everyone is safe. So this is something that's going to be with us for a while. It's necessary to take a global view, but the general trend in recent years was the opposite. There's been a trend towards more nationalism, more protectionism in almost every dimension that you look at. So, Dana, are there any insights you can glean from the CEO's responses on our ability to successfully meet the challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic from a global perspective?
Absolutely. I think that trends involving both globalization and deglobalization likely will appear and reappear and have an impact on the rollout of the vaccine, just as they did in terms of the spread of the pandemic. We're seeing vaccine protectionism, tourism, inequality, and diplomacy. So, thinking about vaccine protectionism, you have economies that have either been the sources of vaccine production or had the finances to buy vaccines, potentially getting vaccines sooner than economies that didn't have the resources to obtain the vaccine. And you're so that's pertaining to the inequality actually. And in terms of protectionism, you have some economies that are not willing to share. I mean, indeed, COVAX is trying really hard to get all the wealthier economies to share, but there's still that view internally that we need to vaccine our own people first before we start extending this to others. And with that, that means that you're going to have entire swaths of the global population that may not have access to the vaccine until 2022 or even 2023. We're also seeing vaccine tourism, right or wrong. Folks are hopping on planes and traveling to places that have vaccines. And so that again speaks to inequality because clearly, if you have the resources to hop on a plane, you probably have, you're probably well off. And so you're seeing that sort of thing happen. And also, when it comes to vaccine diplomacy, you are seeing certain economies like Russia and China using the vaccine as a way to garner soft power in emerging markets, similarly to the way that China used infrastructure investment as a way to curry favor with a number of emerging markets and also issuing of loans. So you're seeing all these things that were uh, evident and problematic during, before the pandemic being played out in terms of vaccines. And to Ottoman's point about no one's safe until everyone is safe is really important because we can think about it this way. Even if you have some of the wealthier, mature economies plus China and Russia vaccinating all of those people, all of their own people, you're still going to have, it's still going to affect global trade and global growth because you're going to have other economies that are not operating at their optimal levels because they're still battling with the virus and vaccinations. So that means that you're not maximizing trade with your trading partners, and so that means less in terms of global growth as well as regional growth. So to the extent, from a moral perspective, in terms of making sure that everyone's safe, it also has economic implications where you're not maximizing output because you're still fighting a virus. So again, it's a combination of things that involve greater extensions of globalization and also, the protectionism that you talked about and the nationalism that's associated with deglobalization. So it's a combination of the two, I believe.
Great. Thank you, Dana. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our podcast, and we have to end there. I'm Ottoman Özyıldırım, Global Research Chair at the Conference Board, and I want to thank my guests also from the Conference Board on this podcast, Dana Peterson, who is Executive Vice President and Chief Economist, and Ilaria Maselli, who is the Senior Economist for Europe. Thank you for sharing those insights with our listeners. And of course, I want to thank our listeners. And if you're interested in downloading the report, it's available at the Conference Board website, www.conference-board.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our Indications podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website. Thank you.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.